They say some people get power, and it goes straight to their head. I didn't know how true that was until I found a neon orange envelope taped to the side of my boat, like a parking ticket in a bad neighborhood. The thing is, this boat wasn't parked on a street, and this wasn't some random public lake. This was my boat, on my lake, tied to a dock that had been built by my grandfather decades before most of the houses in the area even existed. So imagine my reaction reading a notice from the local HOA demanding that I remove my unauthorized watercraft from community waters within 48 hours. Or else. Or else what? A $500 a day fine, escalating penalties, and eventually the threat of having it towed. Towed. From my own lake, by people who didn't even know they were standing on private property. At first I thought it had to be a mistake. Maybe they meant someone else's boat. Maybe they didn't realize. But as I read further, it became clear this wasn't just some clerical error. The language in the letter was smug, almost gleeful in its officiousness. As a member of the Maple Ridge Lakeside community, you are expected to abide by all regulations set forth by the HOA regarding lake usage, visual standards, and environmental compliance. That sentence alone made me laugh out loud. I'm not a member of the HOA. I never signed anything. I don't pay their dues. My property predates the subdivision by decades. But they didn't just assume authority, they claimed it. I could practically hear the keyboard clicks of some self-important board member crafting this nonsense over a glass of boxed Chardonnay, convinced they were doing the Lord's work by ridding the lake of aesthetic violations. What they didn't know, what they hadn't bothered to check, was that the very body of water they were trying to govern didn't belong to them. It belonged to me, legally, deeded. Down to the lake bed, the shoreline, the water rights, the whole thing. But instead of being mad, I was entertained. The sheer audacity was almost impressive. This wasn't just a Karen moment. This was the Karen Olympics, and these folks were going for gold. What they didn't realize was that they weren't picking a fight with just another lakeside resident. They were poking the hornet's nest with a $2 garden rake and grinning while they did it. 6 months before this circus began, I wouldn't have imagined myself dealing with any of this. Back then, I was neck deep in board meetings, late-night code deployments, and venture capital calls in a Silicon Valley office that smelled like stress and too much kombucha. I'd spent 10 years building a cybersecurity firm from nothing. 10 years of 80-hour work weeks and cancelled vacations, and the constant pressure of staying one step ahead of the next big breach. It paid off, financially at least. When a major tech firm offered to buy the company for a sum I still have trouble wrapping my head around, I said yes, without hesitation. Not for the money, though that didn't hurt, but because I was done. Burnt out, hollowed out. I needed space to breathe. That's when I remembered the lake. My grandfather bought the land back in the 1950s, when no one wanted it. Back when it was all trees and silence and maybe a gravel road leading in from the highway. He was a stubborn man, a commercial fisherman who believed in self-sufficiency and long walks in the woods. He built the cabin with his own 2 hands and named the lake after our family. Sullivan Lake. It wasn't on any tourist maps. It wasn't part of any planned community. It was ours. I spent every summer there as a kid, catching frogs, learning to cast a line, listening to stories about respecting the land and protecting what you love. Those memories stayed buried under years of city noise, until the day I needed peace and didn't know where else to go. So I packed up what I needed, hired a crew to bring the cabin into the 21st century, barely, and moved in just as winter started to fade into spring. The mornings were cold, crisp, and silent, in a way that felt like medicine. I traded meetings for muggy hikes, email chains for the sound of loons calling across the lake. My biggest challenge each day was whether to fix the old shed or take the boat out for a few hours of lazy fishing. I felt like I was finally reconnecting with something I'd lost. That boat, in particular, became a ritual. It wasn't flashy, an old aluminum skiff 16 feet, just big enough for one guy and his gear. My grandfather bought it in the 60s and used it until the day he couldn't climb in anymore. I'd patched it up, oiled the motor, even kept his favorite lure in the tackle box like a little tribute. Every time I took it out, I felt like he was there with me, shaking his head at my knots and grumbling about city hands. And that morning, with the sun rising and the lake like glass, I walked down to the dock, coffee in hand, ready to start the day. But that's when I saw it. That ugly orange slap in the face taped right to the hull. Violation notice, in big block letters. I peeled it off and stared at it, thinking maybe it was a joke. But it wasn't. It was real, and it was signed by the president of the Maple Ridge HOA, a man I'd never met, a man who had never once set foot on my dock, a man who, I was starting to suspect, had no idea I existed until now. The notice went on to accuse me of failing to register my boat with the HOA. It cited obscure community aesthetic guidelines, whatever that meant, and warned me that further non-compliance would result in escalated action. My first instinct was to laugh. My second was to start Googling the name Richard Wilkins. That was the name on the letter. President of the HOA. I pictured him with a Bluetooth earpiece and an ironed polo shirt tucked into khakis 2 sizes too tight, and I just knew this was going to get fun. Because what they didn't know, what they didn't even bother to research, was that I wasn't just a new resident. I wasn't a temporary guest or a clueless out-of-towner. I was the one person in the entire community who couldn't be bullied. Because the lake, the dock, the water they thought they owned, that was all mine. And if they wanted to play games, I was more than happy to show them just how badly they'd underestimated the guy in the rustic cabin at the edge of the lake. I hadn't even made it back to the cabin when my phone started ringing. It was Tom, my neighbor, the kind of guy who never calls unless it's something interesting or ridiculous. I picked up, and before I could say anything, he said, "So, looks like the welcoming committee finally found you." I let out a dry laugh and told him about the violation notice. The response was pure gold. "Let me guess," he said. "Bright orange paper, all caps violation, and signed by Richard Wilkins." Bingo. Tom chuckled. "That means you've officially met Karen." Now, Karen wasn't her real name. Her name was actually Valerie Mitchell, but around here, everyone called her Karen. She was the vice president of the HOA, and if Richard was the polished figurehead, she was the engine of micromanagement behind the scenes. According to Tom, she had a clipboard for every occasion, color-coded files on every resident, and an unmatched ability to turn minor inconveniences into full-blown emergencies. It was well known that she once reported a neighbor for having a wind chime she claimed was too aggressive. She ran the HOA board with an iron fist and a passive-aggressive smile, and if Richard was the face of their little regime, Karen was its heart and soul. Tom had been dealing with them for years. He told me about the time they tried to fine him for keeping a small woodpile too close to the property line, despite it being there for over 30 years. When he refused to move it, Karen and Richard personally delivered the violation letter, complete with printed photos, measurements, and a deadline. "I built this house with my own damn hands in the 70s, he told me, "and now they want to tell me where to stack firewood." That's when I realized this wasn't just about my boat. It was a pattern, a culture of control disguised as community organization, and I had just become their latest target. But there was something else Tom said that shifted everything. "You do know they've been using your lake, right? Every summer, tournaments, parties, club meetings, you name it." I stopped in my tracks. "What club?" I asked. "The Elite Anglers," he replied. "Fancy name, bunch of weekend warriors with $1,000 gear and no clue how to fish. They hold their big annual tournament right on your shoreline. East End, near that old willow tree. Been going on for years now. That hit different. I hadn't thought to check what the HOA had been up to during the years the cabin was mostly empty. My dad had stopped coming up regularly after Grandpa passed, and I'd been too wrapped up in tech and city life to even think about it. I figured people were still respectful of property lines out here, but Tom's words suggested otherwise. I needed to know more. So I hung up and went inside, grabbed my laptop, and started digging. The Maple Ridge HOA website wasn't exactly hidden. Right on the homepage, there it was, a rotating banner of happy families, pristine lawns, and in bold letters, Elite Anglers Tournament, celebrating 10 years on our beautiful community lake. I clicked through the gallery, page after page of people lined up with fishing poles, posing with their catches, standing in front of tents and barbecue grills, all on my property. They even had their own logo, a stylized fish wrapped around the letters EA, like they were some elite fighting force instead of a group of middle-aged guys fumbling with tackle boxes. The deeper I looked, the more outrageous it got. There were posts bragging about exclusive access to the East Shore, which I knew from every map and deed I had was squarely on my land. They had built a small floating dock, erected pop-up gazebos, even had porta potties delivered for their events. One article described the lake as Maple Ridge's hidden gem and proud community centerpiece. My jaw just about hit the floor. I scrolled through 5 years' worth of photos, and in every single one, there they were, uninvited, unwelcome, and completely unaware that they were throwing tailgate parties on land they didn't own. And it wasn't just a few rogue events. They had a calendar, a schedule of monthly meetups, junior fishing days, even guided night fishing trips. Someone had monetized my family's lake without so much as a knock on the door. And based on the smug tone of their posts, they believed they had every right to be there. I knew I needed to bring in someone who actually understood the legal weight of what I was looking at. So I called Emma. We went to college together. She's sharp, no nonsense, and now a full-time environmental attorney with a specialty in land and water rights. I laid it out for her as best I could over the phone. The HOA had just threatened to tow my boat, had apparently been hosting major events on my land for years, and were now acting like they owned the lake. There was a pause on the line. Then she burst out laughing. "They tried to tow your boat from your own lake." I could hear the disbelief in her voice. "Jake, that's not just ridiculous. That's legally insane. And these events, if they're holding organized functions on land and water that belong to you without permission, that's trespassing. Civil, maybe even criminal in some cases. Depending on what they've been charging for access, this could start bordering on fraud." She told me to sit tight. "Don't respond to anything yet. Don't move the boat. Don't sign a thing. Start documenting everything. Every notice, every photo, every website post. Take screenshots before they wise up and take anything down. I'll drive up this weekend and we'll go through your records. But first thing tomorrow, install cameras. Discreet ones. Focus on the areas they've been using. Let's catch them in the act." That night, I didn't sleep much. I was wired. Not with anger, but with a slow-burning sense of purpose. I didn't like being pushed. Never have. And now I had a paper trail that proved this wasn't just a one-time mistake. It was a calculated move by people who had gotten too comfortable with pretending they ran the show. Emma was right. This wasn't just about a boat anymore. This was about control, about entitlement, about a group of people who had decided to write their own rules and enforce them like law, all while helping themselves to my family's land as if they were owed it. The next morning, I installed the cameras. 4 of them, high definition, motion triggered, tucked into trees and discreet corners of the property. I focused them on the areas the elite anglers used most often. I checked and double-checked the feed from my phone. Everything worked. Then I dug out the filing box from the back closet, the one my dad had left with all the old paperwork. Inside were the original property deeds, the water rights, and a full survey from 2011, confirming that not just the cabin, but the entire lake and 15 feet of land, beyond its shoreline in every direction, were ours. Clear as day. No easements, no HOA overlap, no shared ownership. My family's name on every page. I leaned back in the old wooden chair by the fireplace and stared out at the water. The same water my grandfather used to call sacred. People don't understand what it means to care for something you didn't build but promised to protect, he used to say. Now it was my turn. And the HOA? They were about to learn that pretending to own something doesn't make it true, because they'd messed with the wrong lake. And I wasn't just going to push back. I was going to push back with everything I had. The HOA meeting was scheduled for a Tuesday evening at the Maple Ridge Community Hall, a building that looked like it desperately wanted to be a courthouse or a country club, but ended up somewhere in between, with fake columns and a fountain that hadn't worked in years. I pulled into the parking lot just before the meeting started, dressed like I always was. Jeans, a flannel, and boots still dusty from walking the trails behind the cabin. I didn't want to make a scene. Not yet. I just wanted to see the people who thought they could take what wasn't theirs, sit quietly, observe, and figure out exactly what I was dealing with. Inside, the air smelled like cheap coffee and overwaxed floors. Rows of folding chairs faced a raised table where 5 board members sat like royalty, presiding over a suburban court. And at the center of it all was Richard Wilkins, looking every bit the part of HOA president. He had that too-perfect hair, silver and styled like he was auditioning for a local news anchor job. His blazer had gold buttons. His smile was polished, but it didn't touch his eyes. And sitting next to him, clipboard in hand and lips pursed like she'd just smelled something unpleasant, was Karen, Valerie Mitchell, clearly already annoyed by the turnout. The room had maybe 30 residents, most of them looking like they'd rather be anywhere else. A few were chatting, distracted, flipping through the printed agenda they'd been handed at the door. Lawn height regulations, fence repainting guidelines, new mailbox color options. It was the kind of bureaucratic boredom that made you question every life choice that led to owning property. I sat in the back, silent, unnoticed, until they brought up the lake. Richard cleared his throat and looked over his reading glasses, scanning the room like he was about to announce something important. We've received reports of an unauthorized watercraft being moored on community waters, he began, already frowning like he was delivering a state of emergency. We want to remind residents that all boats must be registered with the HOA, comply with visual and safety standards, and display the appropriate identification stickers. The lake, he said, pausing for dramatic effect, is one of our community's most valuable shared resources, and maintaining its appearance is a priority. I raised my hand. He blinked, caught off guard. No one else had spoken during the meeting. This wasn't the kind of event that invited questions, let alone challenges. But after a moment, he nodded. Yes, sir, in the back. I stood up casually. Just a quick question about the lake. When you say community waters, what exactly do you mean? Who owns the lake? There was a beat of silence. A few people turned to look at me. I recognized the confusion, the curiosity. Most residents probably hadn't thought about it. They'd just assumed what they were told. Richard's smile wavered. Well, he began, the lake is part of the Maple Ridge community and has been under HOA management since the neighborhood was established. It's a shared amenity, essentially. I nodded slowly, keeping my tone light. So, does the HOA own the lake outright? Or is it owned by the county? Or perhaps a private entity with whom the HOA has an agreement? That got their attention. Heads turned. A woman in the second row actually leaned forward in her seat. Richard hesitated just long enough to give away the lie. "There are historical arrangements in place," he said, a little too quickly. "But the HOA maintains full authority over lake regulations. That's not really relevant to this meeting." I shrugged. "Just curious. I live on the east side, inherited the property. Figured it was good to know how things work around here." Then I sat down, letting the silence settle in. Karen was glaring. Richard was clearly uncomfortable. They rushed through the rest of the agenda with less energy, and when the meeting wrapped up, people started whispering in small groups, eyes flicking back to me like I'd just dropped a match in a room full of gasoline. As the crowd dispersed, I made my way to the exit, but not before I was intercepted by a man in his 60s, with a firm handshake and a vest covered in fishing patches. "Gerald Thompson," he said, sizing me up. "President of the Elite Anglers Club. Don't think I've seen you around before." "I just moved back," I said. "Jake Sullivan. My family owns the cabin on the East Shore. Used to come here as a kid." His eyebrows shot up. "The Sullivan place?" "That's been empty for years. We thought maybe it was abandoned." There was something off about the way he said it, like he was trying to figure out if I knew just how much they'd been using that abandoned property. "Not abandoned," I said evenly. "Just quiet. Until now." "Well, welcome back," he said, recovering with a smile. "You should stop by our tournament this weekend. Big event, good food, great company. Always looking for new members." I almost laughed. The man was inviting me to an illegal fishing tournament being held on my own land, as if he was doing me a favor. "Sounds like fun," I said. "Where's it being held?" "East Shore," he said without hesitation. "Prime spot. Nice shade, good depth. We set up a few tents. You should come see what we're all about." I thanked him for the invite, hiding the storm behind my smile. Because now I had everything I needed. They weren't just trespassing, they were proud of it, advertising it, building a whole little empire around it, and I was done playing nice. But the very next day they took things further. I had just returned from a grocery run when I noticed the dock looked off. I walked down, heart pounding a little harder with each step, and saw what I feared. My boat was gone, completely vanished. No note, no explanation. Just an empty cleat where the rope had been tied. I stood there for a moment, disbelief turning into a cold, focused anger. Then I saw it. Another violation notice, flapping under a rock they'd placed on the dock bench. It said my boat had been removed for non-compliance and was being held until I paid a $750 fine and signed an agreement acknowledging the HOA's authority over lake activities. They stole my boat. There was no other way to put it. And now they were holding it hostage, unless I bowed down and pretended they owned the water I grew up swimming in. That was the moment something inside me clicked. This wasn't just about rules anymore. This was about control, about bullying, about a group of people so sure of their fake power that they thought they could reach onto my property, take what they wanted, and force me to pay for the privilege of getting it back. I called the sheriff's department, thinking this had to be theft, but the deputy I got sounded uncomfortable, like he'd been through this kind of call before. He called it a civil dispute and suggested I try to work things out with the association. I asked him point blank if they had any jurisdiction over my property. He paused, then mumbled something about grey areas and community agreements, before eventually admitting it wasn't clear. That told me everything. Either they didn't know, or they didn't want to get involved. I hung up and called Emma. She didn't waste time with small talk. "They took your boat. Without consent? That's theft. Period. And if the sheriff won't act, we go over their heads. But first, we document everything." That night I didn't feel anger. I felt something sharper. Precision. determination. I gathered every document I had, every deed, every map. We built a timeline. We drafted a list of names, board members, fishing club leaders, even the companies involved in setting up the tournaments. And we outlined exactly how we were going to take them down, not with angry rants or shouted threats, but with facts, with law, with proof they couldn't ignore. Because they hadn't just messed with the wrong guy, they'd messed with the one guy who had both the patience to gather evidence and the legal firepower to burn their little kingdom to the ground. The Saturday of the tournament arrived like something out of a brochure. Clear blue sky, perfect breeze, and the kind of calm morning that would have made for an excellent day on the water if things were normal. But nothing about this was normal anymore. From the deck of my cabin, I watched as a slow, steady procession of trucks and SUVs rolled up along the eastern shore, my shore, like they owned the place. They parked in rows, wheels digging into the grass. Boat trailers were backed into the water like it was a public launch site. Men in matching fishing vests strutted around with walkie-talkies, setting up tents and tables like they were organizing a state fair. One guy even wheeled in a stainless steel BBQ smoker, waving to people as if this were his backyard. They weren't even trying to hide it. At the center of it all was Gerald Thompson, directing people with the confidence of a man who believed he was completely untouchable. He wore his elite angler's vest, like it was military dress blues, chest puffed, clipboard in hand, barking orders about boat placement and weigh-in times. I counted at least 15 boats being launched, and more waiting in line. My shoreline, which had once been quiet, peaceful, untouched, was now a full-blown party ground for people who didn't even know they were trespassing, or worse, knew and didn't care. Emma arrived just before noon, wearing sunglasses and a smirk that told me she was ready. We sat together on the deck, sipping coffee and watching through binoculars as people milled around under the tournament banner. There was even a little merchandise table set up with custom hats and shirts that read, 15th Annual Elite Anglers Championship, Maple Ridge HOA. I don't know what I found more ridiculous, that they were bold enough to throw a branded event on land they didn't own, or that people were willingly buying souvenirs to commemorate their own act of trespassing. Around midday, a group of well-dressed individuals arrived. They didn't look like fishermen. Polished shoes, tailored suits, designer sunglasses, investors. The kind of people who show up to shake hands and nod approvingly at imaginary blueprints. Richard Wilkins was right there with them, giving the grand tour. He pointed out different sections of shoreline, gestured toward the lake, handed out glossy portfolios. From where we stood, we could even catch bits of his pitch. Prime waterfront, long-standing HOA control, minimal opposition, community support already in place. That's when I realized just how deep their plan ran. This tournament wasn't just another flex. It was a front, a performance for the investors, a way to make it look like they had total control of the lake so they could sell a dream of condos, private docks, and elite access to something they didn't legally own. It wasn't just trespassing anymore, it was fraud. And they were committing it in broad daylight, in front of dozens of witnesses, with no idea they were about to be exposed. Emma leaned over. It's time. We didn't go in yelling. We didn't cause a scene. We just walked down the path, calmly, side by side, followed by a sheriff's deputy, who Emma had coordinated with earlier that morning. The deputy wasn't here to arrest anyone, yet, but he was here to make sure no one interfered. Emma held the court order in one hand, a file folder of documentation in the other. When we reached the center of the event, Gerald was the first to see us. His smile faltered. "Can I help you?" Emma didn't bother with introductions. This event is taking place on private property. Mr. Sullivan is the legal owner of the lake and the surrounding shoreline. You are all trespassing. And this, she added, raising the injunction signed by a county judge, is a court order requiring the immediate cessation of all unauthorized activity on this land. The reaction spread like a ripple across the crowd. Confused whispers, then outright panic. People stopped what they were doing. Some froze mid-bite into their pulled pork sandwiches. Others looked toward Richard, who was still with the investors, now visibly flustered as the group turned to him with questions. Gerald's face went red. "This is a mistake. We've held this tournament here for over a decade. The HOA has always—" Emma cut him off. "The HOA has never had legal authority over this lake. We have county records, deeds, and surveys confirming Mr. Sullivan's ownership since 1953. Every use of this lake by your club or your HOA has been unauthorized." Richard finally approached, investors trailing behind him like confused ducklings. He opened his mouth to speak, but Emma handed him a copy of the court documents. "This also includes a cease and desist on any further representation that your HOA has jurisdiction over the lake, including any communications made to potential investors. Misrepresenting ownership for the purpose of soliciting development funding is not only unethical, it's illegal." He glanced through the papers, eyes scanning frantically. His investors weren't even subtle about their reactions. One woman turned and walked straight back to the car. Another flipped through her portfolio and shoved it back into her briefcase, visibly furious. The sheriff's deputy stepped forward, voice loud and clear. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is private property. You've been asked to vacate the premises. We ask that you pack up your equipment and leave in an orderly fashion. If you refuse, further legal action may be pursued." The scene dissolved into chaos. Tents came down. Boats were hauled out of the water. People avoided eye contact. A few muttered apologies. But most just looked stunned, like kids caught with their hands in the cookie jar. Gerald was furious, but cornered. Richard, pale now, tried one last plea. "Mr. Sullivan, there's no need to escalate things. I'm sure we can work out a—" I shook my head. "You had your chance. You took my boat. You lied about my land. And you tried to sell something that was never yours. This isn't a negotiation. This is over." He tried to recover. "You don't understand what you're doing. I have connections in this county. This kind of interference—" I took a step closer. "Then you should call your connections and tell them the deal's off. Tell them the owner of the lake just crashed your party, and he's not going anywhere." By that evening, the property was quiet again. The boats were gone. The smoke from the grills had cleared. And the website for the Elite Anglers Club quietly went offline. But the fallout was just beginning. The next morning, the local paper ran the headline, "HOA exposed for lake fraud." Sarah Lynn, the reporter Emma had looped in a few weeks earlier, had been waiting for the right moment, and she had gotten it. She published everything: the fake authority claims, the trespassing, the development pitch, the court order. Her article exploded online. People all over the region started asking questions. If it could happen here, where else was this happening? The Maple Ridge HOA scheduled an emergency meeting, but half the board didn't even show. Richard resigned by email. Karen vanished from the newsletter, and the residents, finally armed with the truth, started demanding answers. Where had their dues gone? Why had they been lied to? Why were they being charged for lake access when the lake didn't belong to the HOA at all? In the days that followed, my boat was returned, complete with a passive-aggressive letter from the acting HOA president and a grudging apology for the confusion. But it wasn't confusion. It was entitlement, and it had just cost them everything. With Emma's help, we set up a non-profit, the Sullivan Lake Conservation Trust, a legal structure to preserve the lake while allowing fair, limited access to those who respected it. Annual permits were available for residents who wanted to fish or kayak, with all proceeds going into conservation. We worked with the new humbled HOA board to establish clear boundaries and posted signs all around the lake. Private property. Access by permission only. And as for the fishing club, we rebranded it. No more exclusivity, no more elite nonsense. Just a group of folks who loved the lake and respected the land. Anyone could join, as long as they followed the rules. I kept the boat exactly as it was, weathered, dented, proud. I still take it out in the mornings, just like my grandfather did. And every time I drift across the glassy surface of the lake he left me, I'm reminded that protecting what's yours isn't just about ownership. It's about responsibility, about legacy. And sometimes, it's about standing up to people who think they can take whatever they want, just because they've gotten away with it before. They came after my boat. They left with a lawsuit. And now the lake is peaceful again, just the way it was meant to be.